editor at Red Eye, and I'm going to be doing my best to moderate this panel here of our esteemed guests. We just ask everybody to get as we get started, maybe go around and introduce yourself and tell us what you do and how you interact with FOIA. Linda, do you want to start?
Yep, I'm Linda Lutton. I cover schools for WBEZ, public radio here, and pretty much constantly filing FOIAs.
Mick Dumke, I write about politics and criminal justice for the Chicago Reader, and file a lot of FOIAs because at this point in time, local government basically makes you file FOIAs even for very basic requests for information. So even if you don't want to become an expert in this, tough luck, this is your beat, you kind of have to.
I'm Jason Grotto. I'm a writer for the Chicago Tribune. I work on their watchdog team, so I do, obviously, like these guys, rely a lot on the weak FOIA laws that we have here in Illinois. And so, yeah, looking forward to talking about how to navigate that.
Chuck Goudie. I've been at ABC7 since 1980, predating the time that I started working on FOIA requests. I've done investigations for about the last 15 years or so. We basically take two different approaches to FOIA. We have regular kinds of things that we FOIA after people die, regular things with certain elected officials. And then, of course, when breaking news happens or when there are specific projects that we work on, we'll make FOIA requests at that point as well. So we always have something going when it comes to FOIA.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for being here. Thought I'd kick it off by asking everybody to maybe share with us a recent success story that you've had with FOIA for information. Chuck, do you want to start with that?
Sure. We had a very recent story that we decided to FOIA based on a tip that we got from a teacher in Hinsdale. It was a little bit uncomfortable for me because that's where I live, but decided that this was one of those stories that kind of it crosses over a lot of different lines, and I don't have kids that currently go to the school that had been shut down for about a month because of mold. And what we had been told was that the school officials had known about this for years, and they were trying to cover that up, and that there was a trail of emails. So we made a very quick FOIA request for emails for, I think it was a several-year period of time. And they got back to us remarkably fast, and we ended up with a little back and forth narrowing down the FOIA request, but we ended up with several years worth of emails from teachers to administrators that revealed exactly what this tipster told us. That administrators and school district officials and board members knew about the mold problem, and they really hadn't done as much as they could have done. And there were complaints through these years about health, teachers and students getting sick, and the responses from school officials were really lacking. And so that ended up being kind of a standalone story that moved this mold issue forward at least one West Suburban school. We were amazed at the speed with which they responded to us. I think they did ask for one 5-day extension, but after that had everything available for us, and actually seemed happy to turn it over.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that. That's great.
And that was your only positive.
Yeah, well, I mean, there would be others, but that's the most recent one.
Great, thanks. Jason, you want to share a success or a roadblock that you've encountered?
Yeah, well, it's more of just, I guess, our struggles with FOIA. I do FOIA a lot for CPS and the city of Chicago, and it's just a part of my job that I dislike the most. It's just so soul-crushing. So they always file extensions, and there's always issues that we have. But I remember when we were one success that we had was we did these stories on bonds, and we were looking at how CPS was borrowing all this money at a time when the populations were declining, and we had talked with, or the enrollment had been declining. And so we had talked to these school builder experts around the country, and they had said, yeah, well, demographic studies are the first things you look at when you do a capital campaign. So we went to CPS and we said, okay, so you've borrowed $10 billion. We'd like to see, your demographic reports to show, you know, where those kids were gonna be. And they said, oh yeah, we don't have those. And so we're like, we don't believe you. And so we put in a FOIA, and it took 8 months, and you know, we found contracts where they had actually contracted with people, and we're like, well, you paid these people for these things, and somebody has them. And we even found a demographer at UIC who actually had the reports, but couldn't give them out because they had something. Anyway, we eventually had to hire attorneys, and the beauty of it is, you know, if you follow what I'm sure we'll talk about and what you've heard through the conference or today is that, you know, the certain steps that you take in terms of like keeping a log and holding on to the emails and, you know, all that stuff. You know, when we finally did hire the lawyer, we were in a very strong position. And so it turned out that they ended up having to give us some of these records after months and months and months. And, you know, it showed that they just completely ignored all the demographic studies. You know, they just, it was a political, lo and behold. So all that work to tell us the obvious. But, yeah, that was our success story.
But that's why you do it.
Yes.
To have the document trail and the record of things that you suspect or, you know, that you know anecdotally or whatever else. This is something more solid. I mean, there's actually lots of FOIA successes on small stuff that I have or we have all the time. Things like, you know, police reports, just very basic regular data stuff. I ask regularly for like a copy of the City Hall payroll. Sometimes I ask for just the names and titles and salaries. Sometimes I ask for the zip code. Then they'll take the names off and you have to negotiate and all this kind of stuff. But they're sort of, like Chuck was saying, there are routine things that I ask for that at this point in time have become, you know, it's almost like a familiarity with the people you're dealing with, and those, you know, those come back relatively efficiently. But other stuff not so much. And you know, like several years ago, I started asking the city for copies of the mayor's daily schedule, not the one that he releases to the media where he's going to be making a public appearance, but who he's actually meeting with, what his hour-to-hour schedule is. And I did this initially because Barack Obama was posting a log of all the White House visitors, but we couldn't get the same information about what was going on at City Hall. And long story short, the daily administration first gave me small snippets of it. When I asked for more, they fought me. I went to court over it. They eventually coughed it up. And now I just regularly ask for it from Rahm Emanuel's people, even when I'm not using it in a story right away. Jason said how this was sort of soul killing, and it is in a certain sense, but I also kind of find it kind of fun. I just imagine what it's like for them to get the same thing. And actually tried a strategy of like, look, I'm going to ask for this much of it. You can either give it to me all at once, or I'll just keep asking for it in little blocks. And of course, they don't want to give it to me all at once. So I'm like, all right, we'll both hold hands together while we're tiptoeing through the tulips. And so that's something I consider both an ongoing obstacle and an ongoing success, because I've just basically said, look, I'm going to keep asking for this. You could stop dealing with me if you put the whole thing online for everybody to see, but they don't want to do that. So. Thanks.
All right. I guess I have, one recent thing was I had FOIA'd for the, when the 50 schools closed, we were very interested in, you know, the school district was giving these weekly transition updates that seemed like staged media events with all the department heads. You know, fire department, check, you know, we're good. All the sidewalks are fixed, all the streets are fixed, these kids are ready to go to their welcoming schools. And we were asking questions about, like, well, how many kids are actually going to go to these welcoming schools? And we never got good percentages there. So we had a request in very early on to get numbers on exactly from every student who was at a school closed in June, where that student's destination school was. And we broke that story. I'm sure that's something that every education reporter was interested in knowing. You know, they turned that, finally fulfilled that FOIA the Friday before the first day of school. And it showed something radically different than what they had been saying all along. They had been saying right up until the end that, you know, that almost everybody was enrolled and that 80% of kids were enrolled at these welcoming schools where we spent a lot of money. And the truth was that there was a total diaspora of kids. They ended up, 60% were enrolled in these, only 60% were enrolled in welcoming schools, and in the end, you know, the kids from closed schools ended up at more than 400 different CPS schools. And I'll say, I think to this notion of asking for consistent data, I asked for that data again after the 20th day, which is an official count day, and the data looked different, and we reported it again and said this has gotten even worse than we initially thought. So, and then you have comparable data, and you can say, oh, the data they gave us earlier was, you know, it looked bad, but the truth is it's even worse. So keep asking for things. Once you've looked at a data set, it's easy to look at another data set and find changes there.
That's great, thank you. I moved over so more people could see. You know, everybody who's ever filed a FOIA has probably run into roadblocks. You guys have talked about how it can be difficult and sometimes soul-crushing to deal with these formulaic requests. What's the #1 roadblock that you run up against, and how do you deal with it? Let's start with you, Chuck.
Well, I'm not sure that we've found that there's a #1. This is kind of a constantly evolving process, and people dig up and throw new excuses at us all the time. And in fact, they're given new excuses because frequently Congress passes laws that have FOIA lines built into them, and we find out about them too late, and we find out when there are exemptions thrown at us. Most notably, there's an environmental law right now that if it makes it through Congress will pretty much lock up a lot of the things that we frequently ask for. But one of the things that is frequently thrown at us in the state of Illinois, and maybe in other places as well, is I'll use the toll authority as an example. They have privatized the toll oases. So when we have asked for contracts with the businesses that have been in there to see if they were the result of political favoritism or corruption or whatever, we've been told, can't give you any of it. That's privately owned property now. We've farmed that out. And at least to date, for us, they have managed to kind of move that out of the government arena and prevent us from having those contracts. Now, that doesn't mean it's the only way to get them. There can be other ways than FOIA to come up with similar information through lawsuits and other things that may be filed. You can kind of trace your way through it if it's important enough to spend that much time. But at least in Illinois, not only the tollway, but also with now parking meters, with divvy bikes and other things, we found it very difficult to kind of crack through what the government has set up as being a private contract situation.
Yeah, that's a really good point. My biggest obstacle with FOIA is the Illinois statute. It's just a very weak statute. If I worked for a decade in Miami, in Florida, where they have probably one of the best statutes in the country, so I was spoiled at a young age. The law here in Illinois is not only weak, but the mechanisms to try to appeal FOIA denials are very, very weak as well. I had a similar situation where it turns out all these pension funds are invested in venture capital, private equity they call it, like hedge funds and stuff. And so they're just one investor in this big private enterprise. And so what I wanted to know is, okay, well, what are you guys buying? Like, if you put in $20 million into XYZ private equity firm, what is it that the pension fund is getting? What are the, we try to just find out what the actual investments were. And we just had this going back and forth with them because the private equity firms were like, well, this is a private business. And I was like, yeah, but it's $20 million in public money. And we went round and round, and we went through the public access counselor, and I still have like stacks of letters like 6 months later where they're responding, and it doesn't matter, the story's over. Maybe someday I'll go back, but even if you appeal to the public, what do they call it, access counselor, if they don't find in your favor within the requisite 60 days or whatever they find is not binding. So it's like, even if you win, it takes them so long, they have a backlog and all this other stuff. Because, you know, one of the things you realize, especially here in Illinois and Chicago, is there's like the frontline people that you get on the phone, the FOIA officer, and they have to then go to the CFO or the treasurer. And the gap in terms of on the ladder is so deep that these other people above them could ignore the request. In fact, I've had conversations about that they do. The FOIA officers are trying to get the request, but there's no teeth in the law, and so these guys never feel any blowback, so they just ignore it. And then I end up, you know, I try to be sweet to the FOIA officer, because I know it's not really their fault, you know, I try to be nice to them. But then after a while, you're just like screaming into the wind, just spitting into the wind. And so yeah, I guess that's my biggest hurdle. The law itself is really bad.
Yeah, I would basically say amen to all that. I mean, the biggest hurdle is simply that the law is weak and that people don't comply with the law. I mean, as weak as it is, they don't even comply with that. So if there's no will to provide the information, then the agency just doesn't do it, plain and simple. So I actually, you know, if there's any advice to give, I guess it's, you know, my experience has been that you never assume you're going to be able to build a story around anything you're getting from a FOIA. You know, if
Or
you're,
it's going to take twice as long.
or it's going to take so long, but there's no guarantee that short of going to court and then dealing with Cook County judges, who are a lot of them political appointees as well, that, you know, there's just no guarantee you're going to get the information that you think is out there, or even that you know is out there. So I think of FOIA more as a public shaming mechanism. So it's a way to apply some, you have leverage, it's a way to apply pressure. And, you know, Lynn and I were chatting before we started this, and, you know, if you're waiting for the information to come in, at this point in time with blogs and everything else, it's like, you know, find a way to write about how they're stalling. And it's just like, keep writing about, sometimes the story is what they're covering up. And sometimes don't even have anything to cover up, they're still covering it up. And so you write about that. And that I found to be more effective than the law itself, is just the notion that people, at this point in time, it's bad politics to be opposed to open government. It's bad politics to, everybody's transparent. I don't even know what the word means anymore. The word transparent is itself opaque, the meaning of it. But everybody's in favor of it, whatever it is, so you kind of use that to apply pressure. And when they're not even on a basic level responding to a FOIA request, I think you can use that to your advantage in different ways.
That's great.
Yeah, and I just second everything, especially the privatization of public services. I do want to, I had highlighted this one part of the whole FOIA law was the part that referenced the privatization of public services, or duties that the public body is charged with. And theoretically, and you know, education reporters run into this on charter schools. I mean, this part of the law, which is under Section 7 exemptions, you know, it says a public record that is not in the possession of a public body but is in the possession of a party with whom the agency has contracted to perform a governmental function on behalf of the public body and that directly relates to the governmental function and is not otherwise exempt, shall be considered a public record of the public body. And on charter schools, you know, we have opinions from the AG's office, the public access counselors, that say charter schools are essentially private contractors providing the government service of public education and are subject to this law. And I think, you know, it's up to reporters to push harder on that and to cite this specific clause in cases like that. But government is getting fuzzier and fuzzier. We have many quasi-public agencies. Like I've also looked at After School Matters, a nonprofit that's almost wholly funded by, it gets a lot of private donations, but it's principally funded by public dollars, has been. And you know, that the transparency there is almost non-existent. And I think my colleagues are making a good point regarding the FOIA officers. I am best friends with the regular FOIA officers. I think it's very important for you to begin, especially if you deal with a certain agency a lot, to really understand the dynamics of that person's particular job. Like, where does the pressure come from on them? So FOIA officers are often in a law department, and the pressure they're gonna get is from law, from their bosses. But in a city in which, you know, we have an administration that's very concerned about essentially not giving out information it doesn't want to give out, these FOIA officers are also getting pressure from public information offices, communications offices. Those are the offices that control the flow of information. And so understanding the dynamics and learning how to strategically play on those can be important and helpful.
That's such a good point. I was just gonna say that's such a good point, because I know Cassandra, our friend Cassandra, and you know, like when we ended up getting the lawyers to sue, I actually just went in to talk to Cassandra and just say, look, you know, like, I know it's not you, because she gets the blowback then people get mad at her, and it's not really her fault. I mean, for the most part, you know, so that's such a good point.
When all this started, there was supposed to be some kind of a Chinese wall between the communication offices, the public affairs people, and the people who did FOIA. Now it's very frequent that, you know, you'll get a call immediately after filing a FOIA from whoever runs the PR branch of whatever entity it is that you're FOIAing. There is no wall between them anymore. It's one and the same, it seems, in most places. And it's not how it should be, but that's the reality of it. But I did want to say that, at least from our vantage point, I know you guys do hire lawyers and fight this from time to time, but it's fairly well known among government agencies that television stations, at least in Chicago, are, you know, I mean, we're pointing an unloaded gun at them when we file a FOIA. Because they know that we're not going to shell over, you know, tens of thousands of dollars to take most of these FOIA events to court. And so we're routinely ignored. We're constantly pressing people to say, hey, you know, what happened to the FOIA that we sent you 6 weeks ago? We never got an answer at all, much less a request for an extension. But you know, that's an internal battle that we have, and at a time when TV stations are making 40% of what they were 10 years ago, it's not a battle that we're going to win. And it would have to be a major story, major undertaking for us to go into court and fight a FOIA denial.
Yeah, I mean, I feel truly blessed that we recently started to, we used to have an attorney on staff, and he was fired. So they now have attorneys on retainer, and luckily, you know, because of what, you know, the office that I work out of, we're able to work with them because they're reading our stuff all the time, the legal department. And so yeah, I mean, it's a huge thing to have a lawyer. It just is. It'd be a good thing for a university to do with their law department, you know, set up a little FOIA thing.
Yeah.
Because the law is pretty toothless, I think.
And that would be another good thing for journalists, like as a group, you know, in terms of SPJs, you know, a headline club here, potentially working on a further rewrite of Illinois' FOIA law is another important thing to look at.
Absolutely. Nick, anything to add before we segue into question and answer session?
It's good for now.
No? Okay, well, let's open it up to questions then. Strikes?
If you ask for a bunch of stuff from an agency like an audit, contracts, emails, and they keep asking for 5-day extensions, are you weakening your argument at all if you say just give me what you got now and let's keep it going? Or are you best to wait for it, if they'll do that?
I wouldn't wait for everything.
So you're not
sometimes
yourself in a
put
weaker position by
No, I don't
just
think
take
so.
what you get?
You're still asking for it. I mean, the two things. First of all, I ask for stuff in smaller chunks because, you know, they're going to probably delay anyway, but I try to give them less of an excuse to delay. So if there's a huge stack of things, I mean, also just be realistic. You know, as everybody's pointing out, there's usually one person who's in charge of this, and maybe they have people helping them gather the information, but these are human beings at the other end of the phone or the, you know, getting your email or whatever. So, you know, try to be realistic about what you're asking for. Or you can say ahead of time, look, I'm going to ask for all this stuff. I'll ask for it in pieces or however is the easiest way to ask for it, but I want it. It doesn't mean you're being weak or you're yielding anything. To basically say, hey, look, person to person, what's the best way for me to ask this and what's the easiest way for you to provide it to me, you know. But I sometimes will write when it's a voluminous request, I will basically say, please let me know as it becomes available and stuff like that.
You do have to be prepared when these FOIAs come in for what you get. When one of the very first FOIAs we ever made was when Tony Accardo, the head of the Chicago mob, died. We immediately filed a request for all of his federal files. And at that point, there wasn't quite the backlog at the FBI that there is today. And I think it was about 8 months or so that they called us and said, your request is in. We can either ship it to you, or this was before fax and email. It wouldn't have happened anyway. We overloaded our system. But they said, or you can go to our warehouse in Savannah, Georgia. And so we had heard that there was competition for this file with another Chicago television station. So we went to Savannah, and I spent 2 days in a motel room with box loads of Tony Accardo files, thousands of pages going through it to try to put together a 2-minute TV story. So don't always wish for the mother load. You might get it.
And that's a strategy sometimes too, is the data dump. You probably heard the term, and goes back at least to the Nixon administration. I think they would do this on a Friday afternoon during the whole Watergate pressure. They would suddenly release thousands of pages of documents, so people, on Friday at 5 o'clock had to start right there looking for something. So it's part of the strategy.
One other thing that has to do with this question is I also too always try to figure out if what I'm looking for is actually just up on the website. Like past audits, you mentioned contracts, all those things, because I cover the public body regularly, I know where to get most of those. And I try specifically not to burden the public body with things that I know are already publicly available. And the other thing I do is I use inside sources to try to figure out what form this comes in. Like, I'll call up somebody and say, when kids flunk a class and they make up a class on credit recovery, how does that get coded? How do you know that kid passed the class that way? And then I know specifically that there's a file that somebody keeps, and I know what that thing is called, and I probably know by then who has it, which is another thing you could try to do. And sometimes this person in the public body actually doesn't know where to get what you want, and doesn't actually know what it even is. And so I often, I brought a little excerpt from a FOIA I filed. I said, to assist the district in locating the assessments quickly that I'm requesting, I've already said what I want. I'm copying Chief Administrative Officer Tim Cawley and Chief Operating Officer Pat Taylor on this email because I believe they are likely to have access to the assessments I'm seeking. I know they have access to these assessments. I copy them on the email. The FOIA officer knows where to go, and there really should be no excuse for not providing what I'm asking for.
Plus, they always get right back to Linda. So.
All our lawyers.
So what happens when you get a response that says, we have no responsive documents, but it's something that you would bet every penny you have that it really exists and they're just lying? What happens when, how do you prove that they're lying, and how do you, get past that stalemate?
Well, I think a lot of it goes to what Linda was just saying, which is basically you have to report out your FOIA before you file it. You have to know what is the name of the document, who has it. Find other sources to say that that it's there, and so that you can bet the house that it's there. There are times though, I think, when sometimes we get a little paranoid, like something will come back and really maybe there isn't anything there. It's hard to prove a negative or disprove a negative. I think that's what it is. But yeah, I think what Linda was saying is key, is understanding the proper name. Like we asked the city for something and we weren't specific about it, and they're like, we have nothing, and then we're like, all right, fine, we'll ask it this way, and they're like, okay. So it's anyway.
Wherever I go, I try to notice what is being collected. Like when kids are suspended, they often get a form that they bring home. Any form that government gives out is likely entered somewhere in some database. So if there's a form on the whatever website that people are filling out, you can ask for the responses to that form. Who filled that form out? What did they put in their answers? I mean, wherever you're out there reporting, if you're go into a city, you know, snow plow lot and you see, people punching in and punching out, guess what? People's, time in and time out is FOIA-able. Wherever you are, try to begin to notice what sort of records are being kept.
And then if they claim they don't have them, that is a story. That's a story. Like someone's lying or they're not keeping records they're supposed to be keeping, either of which is a story.
That's great. Anybody over here? Up front?
Yeah, I had a question. There's one situation like Chuck's where your tipster said there's emails and you FOIA emails, you know what you're going after. I wonder if you guys could talk more about when you're sort of fishing, how you approach the situation when you know there's information but you don't totally know exactly what it is you want. Like, does that change how you craft the FOIA, or is it just more reporting? Like, walk me through that process.
Well, because we're on the air so much, our stories really, or our FOIAs are really tailored towards specific ideas or projects that we've already thought through. We don't do a lot of just broad FOIAs, you know, of things that might be on, you know, speculative stories. There are general areas that we would FOIA. You know, for instance, different kinds of things that the government's purchased. One story that one FOIA that resulted in a story not long ago was we FOIA'd government agencies that had local government agencies that had bought from a Defense Department program a bunch of old vehicles, weapon systems, clothing, you know, all sorts of generators, things like that, and where they ended up in the state of Illinois. So we didn't know specifically what we were looking for at that point, but just asked for any and all you know, records that would relate to purchases like this. The more general thing that we do, we definitely FOIA the personal files of any notable person who dies, as soon as the person dies. Whether it's a mob figure, a politician, a cop, an entertainer with local ties who might have been controversial for some reason. 9 times out of 10, there won't be anything in those records when they come back, but you don't know, and if you don't ask, you don't get the files, you're never going to find out. So that is an area that I'm big on and have been over the years.
Do you just do FBI?
No, not necessarily. It's a little bit easier now, at least we've found. If you file the FOIA at the right place, it'll get kind of siphoned off to the right agency. If it's sent to the right place and worded in the right way, you can go to each individual agency if you know that there are records that exist there. Like if it's an organized crime figure, we'd know to go to the FBI and the IRS probably, and usually those two organizations, or maybe the DEA would be another one that we would file their DEA file.
I think the reporting thing again speaks to your question. Is, you know, you try to do some reporting before you file a FOIA. If you can't do enough, you know, or you can't get to where you need to go, then yeah, I have filed broad FOIAs, and then what I'll usually do is try to follow up with them and turn it into more of like a negotiation. Like, okay, I'm asking for this, and I have this line I always use, like, I want it to be as easy on you as possible. I mean, you guys are really busy too, and, you know, so what can I do to help craft this in a way that's gonna make it easier for you guys? I remember when I was in Miami, we did a school construction thing, and we started out asking for like this huge database, and they were like, oh, because they had really good FOIA laws then. Like here they would just say unduly burdensome. That's another one you'll learn, unduly burdensome. But so what we would say is, well, we'd like to negotiate. We'd like to, like, you know, do you produce a report for internal auditing purposes that maybe that, you know, summarizes all the information that we're looking for. You know, you try to get into can we talk to your data guy and try to help craft the FOIA. With the city and the school district, that's pretty hard. But I think you can get there if you're persistent enough, you know, and so the FOIA becomes more of a negotiation to get inside how the place operates.
With the story demands on almost all of us these days to produce more, faster, more often, those broad kinds of fishing expeditions are rare. It's more often that we either have a specific idea we're curious about, something we've seen, or something somebody has told us that we then try to prove up by, you know, a variety of ways, one of which might be FOIA. one of the best FOIA stories that I have is when Rod Blagojevich was at the Democratic Convention, and it was the year that Barack Obama gave his famous speech. Just happened to be standing in front of the hotel where the Illinois delegation was staying, and I saw these Illinois black SUVs pull up, Illinois plates. And Blagojevich and his wife and their kids got out of this chauffeured SUV. These were not livery services from the airport. They were driven by Illinois State Police officers from Illinois. And they go around to the back, the cops, and they pull out the luggage and carry it in like they're his valets, which we now know they were. But at the time, it was a little bit curious. They carry in the strollers for the kids and the toys and things. That was the beginning of a FOIA event for us that went on for about 1.5 years. We FOIA'd all of his trip records, we FOIA'd state police records to see who was doing what, and what we found is that Blagojevich had been having these cars driven across the country for him so he could be chauffeured around in style wherever he went. The Illinois State Police would drive to Southern California, a whole caravan of state police vehicles, to meet Rod at the airport, so he could be driven with lights and sirens to his hotel. And it all came from an observation, very specifically one afternoon at the Democratic Convention, that they kind of exploded into a whole litany of FOIAs.
That's a great story. Anybody else have a question?
I have a question. Once you get your FOIA back, I've heard from my school districts, well, it's not our job to explain to you the results of this FOIA. The law doesn't compel me to do that. So can you talk about how you pressure your public bodies once you get your information to say something about it?
I would, if in the case of a school district, I mean, I would try to figure out what it means through, again, just reporting, try to make connections with teachers, or I don't know what the data would involve, but try to say, oh, I've got this data, does this make any sense to you? Is this what your school's doing? So, I mean, I really, really value the comments that would come from, people at the very ground level of things. So whether that's in a school, like what high school kids tell you, do a lot of kids in your school get suspended? Does that line up with the data you have? Garbage truck drivers, I mean, these people can give you invaluable insight into the data you have if you can't get someone at the top to explain it. And then sometimes you go back to the school district and say, oh, I've talked to a lot of teachers and they're explaining it this way. Is that how you understand it? I'm ready to go with my story. Can you, do you have anything to say about this? Do you want to make any corrections? This is your opportunity.
In that Hinsdale mold story that we just did, they were emails, so we had names of teachers who wrote and complained. We were able to go back to them and have them tell us what it was that they meant, what the specifics were behind the comments that they had written up, and whether anything was done that wasn't reflected in the email. So, I mean, frequently there will be names of people you can call who aren't FOIA officers. They're not necessarily even officials of whatever agency it is, who, even if it's catching them at home or catching them at a point where they don't necessarily have time to to consider who you are and why you're asking these questions, you may well be able to get further information that way.
Great insight. Over here?
Hi, Linda mentioned privatization, which I think is a huge issue in Illinois and Chicago. I'm interested in just finding out more where that stands. The Attorney General's Chief of Staff this morning said that they have binding resolutions, non-binding, and then 70% of the binding go to litigation in court. So where does the privatization clause that a contractor has to disclose governmental functions, where does that stand in the scheme of the new Illinois FOIA reform?
So what I read you was from the law. And how that law is being interpreted, I'm probably not the best person to ask, but I mean, I think that's pretty clearly laid out in the law, and I think journalists should push hard to see that that's
Have there been any
fulfilled.
binding resolutions?
I know from my reporting that I don't believe it's been a binding resolution, but there have been opinions, and maybe there have been binding resolutions that I'm not aware of, but there have been opinions that ed reporters, locally have gotten. I know Catalyst got this, that says charter schools must comply with the FOIA law. And sometimes it's tricky whether whether, and I think there's been mixed sort of opinions on this, whether the journalist has to request the information through the public body, and then the public body is expected to keep that data, and sometimes it claims it doesn't keep it, but I've had actually good luck with the public access counselor. That's something else I would encourage you all to do, especially in the case of FOIAs that are timely, where you don't have time to sit around for months and months and wait and see what comes back. We would, during the school closings debate leading up to the school closings, we were very intentional about filing immediately with the public access counselor. On the 5th day, if we hadn't heard back, on the 10th day, we, and I always called, the FOIA officer and said, are you anywhere near on this? Because if you're anywhere near, I can give you till 5 o'clock, but I'm gonna put this in with the public access counselor at 5 o'clock. And I also, another thing I would do is if I was gonna get hard ass about a FOIA, and I was gonna call that public access counselor in 5 days, I sometimes would copy the general counsel of Chicago Public Schools, and I would specifically have a line that says, this is currently being debated, this FOIA is urgent, I urge you to expedite it, because this is currently under public discussion. I mean, I'm essentially giving them a warning that I'm gonna play hardball, and on the 5th day, if they hadn't responded, I gave that phone call to Cassandra, I gave her 8 hours, and then I filed with the public access counselor. And every time it was expedited through the public access counselor. And I also used language in my letters to the public access counselor that said, in my experience, this failure to respond is part of a pattern in Chicago Public Schools of failing to respond to FOIA requests within the deadline set forth in the law. And I find that when you establish language like that, lawyers understand those kinds of words, right?
And you feel better after writing.
I'm just using, it's just a form at this point. I just plug it in, copy and paste.
By doing all this stuff, we engage in the political process. So the public access counselor is not some independent entity just sitting out there by itself. It's like falls under the state attorney general's, purview, and this is an attorney general who's very interested in being known as a progressive politician. And you kind of have to know that. That's again part of your leverage, I think. So it's kind of like you sometimes have to put a little pressure on the public access counselor. And if they don't respond either, I've written about them not responding. I mean, and the charter school thing, privatization stuff, we wrote a whole story one time just about how the varying responses we got from different charter schools to FOIAs that we sent out, asking for basic stuff about compensation of their employees, which, is supposed to be widely available, but some of them just ignored us, some of them like basically threatened to take us to court, and others actually complied in some meager fashion, and we wrote about all of it. And then, I got a call, an off-the-record call from a member of the State Board of Education. Like, they're watching this stuff. And again, the optics are so bad, you just have to know that and use that to your advantage.
And we should mention maybe that the Sun-Times does have a pending lawsuit, right, against UNO, at least, and they've written about that. And I think there, UNO had said that the charter management organization, UNO, did not hold the documents, but that UNO, the nonprofit community organization, did hold the documents, but is not subject to FOIA law.
Yeah, this all gets to such crazy logic. I mean, I went to court because I FOIA'd something that Mayor Daley had alluded to in a press conference that was a police study, and the city claimed that it was not open to the public because it was a police study, and just because Mayor Daley mentioned it, he's not the head of the police department. And so this was a thing that took 2.5 years in courts before they finally said, oh wait, Mayor Daley actually does oversee the police department.
All right, so we have about 5 minutes left. Just wanted to be mindful of everybody's time. Panelists, if you want to give one closing remark.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, in response to your question, that the Attorney General's office just put out a press release touting their